So we're into these rules of three. We had the three things that the three areas where Rabban Gamliel was strict, like the words of Beit Shammai, and the three areas where he was lenient, and the three cases that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah permitted and the sages forbade. And then we segued from there into questions about the pepper mill, which was Mekabel Tumah, which was susceptible to impurity because of three elements sitting inside it. And we are now going to segue from the pepper mill, which is susceptible to tumah, which is susceptible to becoming impure because of these three things, to something completely different. It's a child's buggy. And then we're going to close the chapter with a child's buggy, and we're going to go on to questions about catching and slaughtering food on Yom Tov, catching and slaughtering animals. And I'm not sure actually whether the child's buggy fits into the rule of three, but anyway, it seems to jump off the three issues of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, and it finishes off the chapter. And I was honestly surprised to find out that children had buggies in the time of the Mishnah, but the Mishnah and the Bartanura are completely clear about it. Agala shel katan, a child's cart or a child's buggy, and the Bartanura explains Agala, that a cart, ha'asuya lischok la katan, made for a child to play with, umiyuchedet lo leishev alav, and especially for him to sit on. So that we got a child's buggy that a child is maybe sitting in. And the Mishnah, following Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and the pepper mill, wants to remind us that it can also be susceptible to tumah, agala shel katan tamei midras. A child's cart can be susceptible to the impurity of midras. Now, v'nitelet b'Shabbat, but it can be handled on Shabbat. What's this midras? We have a pasuk in Vayikra, Kol HaMishka. It's about someone who's had an emission, and this is all in the beginning of the 15th chapter of Vayikra, and the pasukim go on to say, Kol HaMishkav asher yishkav alav, any bedding on which he sits, and this is the one who has the discharge. Sits. Kol hamishkav asher yishkav alav hazav yitma. Any bedding on which the one which the discharge lies shall be impure. V'chol kli asher yeshev alav yitma. And every object he sits on is going to be impure. And the child's cart is going to be sat on. It's going to be sat on like a bed. So it's subject to the same kind of impurity. This is nothing to do with Yom Tov and nothing to do with Shabbat, by the way. We're making a purely technical point. And we did say, yes, last time we met, when we looked at the pepper mill, the fact that the pepper mill can become tameh because of three things is just a continuation of the rule of three. If you like, it's the mnemonic with which the Mishnah is organized. It's the mental pattern with which the Mishnah is organized. It's nothing to do with Beytzah, nothing to do with the egg, and nothing to do with Yom Tov. And we're just following that idea. So the child's cart is susceptible to the impurity if someone sits on it who's had an emission. And by the way, v'nitelet b'Shabbat, it can be taken out on Shabbat. Ve'eina nigreret ela al gabei kelim, but we can't drag it along except if we drag it along on matting or on clothes. What's going on there? Well, the Bartanura is going to explain Eila al Kalim, and I've translated Kalim as clothing here, actually, in the Bartanura, on top of clothing. He actually says al gabe begadim, on top of clothing. Because it makes a sort of a ditch, a furrow in the ground. And someone who digs out a kind of furrow in the ground is liable on the av malacha, on the archetypal work of plowing. So we can't drag this child's wagon along on Shabbat, except when it's supported by, when it's got some cloth underneath it. And Rabbi Yehuda actually sort of disagrees. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Kol hakelim ein nigraim chutz min ha'agala. Actually, Rabbi Yehuda says no vessels may be dragged along except a wagon, mipnei shehi koveshet, because it presses down the earth. So Rabbi Yehuda's problem is not so much making a furrow in the earth as it's dragged along, but pushing down on the earth, if you like, humping down on the earth by pressing on it from above. So Rabbi Yehuda has a different view. And that's where we close the second chapter before going on to the whole question of catching. And we're going to go back to this Latin word vivarium. They used to construct places in the time of the Mishnah where they would keep wild animals until they were ready to eat them. And it's vivarium in Hebrew, or I think probably vivarium in Greek, or it's probably vivarium in Latin. Question is, if our animals are running around the vivarium, can we catch them on Yom Tov? We've pretty much agreed, we understand that we can slaughter them on Yom Tov, because in the era before refrigerators, you had to slaughter your meat or your fish fresh. So we know we can slaughter on Yom Tov, but perhaps the action of catching could be done the day before Yom Tov. And we've established the principle. Anything that can be done before Yom Tov should be done before Yom Tov. We do cook on Yom Tov, but only we cook and we prepare for cooking on Yom Tov, but only with activities which are necessary. And the Mishnah gives us this slightly puzzling rule, actually. Ein sadin dagim min vivarium b'Yom Tov. We don't catch fish from a vivarium on Yom Tov. Ve'ein not nim lifnehem mezonot. And we don't feed them. I think the assumption here is we don't feed them because we might come to catch them. Aval. Sadin chayav off min vivarium, they're not nim lifnehem mezonot. But we can catch animals and birds from a vivarium, and one can put food in front of them. So what is the difference between catching fish that we're not allowed to do and catching animals and birds that we are allowed to do? And by the way, thinking about it rationally in terms of what we can and can't do before Yom Tov, well, you could easily catch an animal before Yom Tov and just tie it up. But you cannot catch a fish before Yom Tov and tie it up because fish don't tie. And Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel is going to explain. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, and he's going to try to elucidate what is going on in this Mishnah. Lo kol ha-vivarian shavim. Not all vivaria are alike. So there are basically vivariums and vivariums, or vivaria and vivarium. Zeh klal. This is the general principle. Kol ha-mechussar tzeidah asur. Anything that still needs trapping is forbidden. In other words, if you have something like a giant animal park or a big fish pond, and you really need to kind of run around and trap your animal, that is forbidden. But if you have a small little pen, that's something different. Veshe'eino mechussar tzeidah mutar. Something that does not need to be trapped is permitted. And I guess if we learn this Mishnah according to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, we would say, look, the fish vivarium was a big one and the animal one was a small one. I think we would say it that way, but he certainly articulates the general rule, which is about hunting. We can kind of catch something which is already sitting there. We can't actually go out and hunt it. What about if we found the animal in a trap? So the animal is there for the taking, but it's in a trap. Mutsudot chayav off vedagim she'asa'am me'erev Yom Tov. What about traps for wild animals or birds or fish, which we were actually set before Yom Tov? So we've already set the trap. And the Mishnah articulates, Lo yitol mehem b'Yom Tov. You can't take animals out of them on Yom Tov. In other words, you set your trap before Yom Tov on You wander along. Maybe you set it on Friday. You wander along on Sunday. Yesterday, you find an animal in your trap. Are you allowed to eat it? So the Mishnah, the first opinion says, we don't do this. We don't do it unless we know that they were actually caught on Erev Yom Tov, i.e. they were already caught. And we seem to be getting here into questions of muktzah and designation. So do you remember at the very beginning of this cycle, we learned about the dovecot, someone going to his dovecot and designating the doves and saying, look, this one and this one I'm going to catch and I'm going to eat on Yom Tov. And by designating it, you make it ready for Yom Tov, and that permits you to go and catch it and use it on Yom Tov itself. And of course, the thing about an animal which just lands in your trap on Yom Tov is that before Yom Tov, you had no idea that it was going to land in your trap. It's just a random animal. If it's not designated to land in your trap, just like an apple that fell off the tree, which is also muktzah, because before Yom Tov, it wasn't designated for eating. You didn't know this apple is going to fall off the tree and land on the ground and be ready to be eaten. If it's not designated for hunting or for eating before Yom Tov, then the fact that it falls into the trap doesn't really help. Umas. Now, what if a non-Jew? Interesting. What if a non-Jew brought it? A non-Jew once brought fish to Rabban Gamliel. Ve'amar mutarin hen. He said they are permitted. So maybe these were fish caught from the kind of vivarium where we're allowed to catch fish. He said they're permitted. But, and as we've seen elsewhere, by the way, with Rabban Gamliel, he sometimes has different standards for himself. Ve'amar mutarin hen, he said they're permitted. Ela she'ein ritzoni lekabel hemenu, but I do not wish to receive them from him. I.e., he has a higher standard in terms of his own behavior than that which he mandates for the rest of the people of Israel.